Do you remember the first time that you tried to read Revelation? What kind of experience did you have? Was it confusing, intimidating, exhilarating, mind-boggling? Perhaps you've experienced some of these feelings as you've tried to read Revelation. We hope to take some of the mystery out of it by taking you through the readings in Duval and Hayes and then later in Fee and Stewart. But in this section, we're going to give you an introduction to the book of Revelation. We're going to talk about historical context, literary genre, the purpose of Revelation, how to interpret Revelation, how does it unfold. Then we're going to put it into the interpretive journey, the 5 steps, bring it to a conclusion, and then make some assignments. The term revelation suggests something that was once hidden, and now it is being openly revealed. The word revelation is apocalypsis in Greek, from where we get our word apocalyptic. So, to speak about the book that was once hidden is now being unveiled and displayed openly. The book of Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Christ is the subject of the revelation, and the revelation from Jesus Christ shows that Christ is the author. Now, one word of caution here, students. When you talk about the book of Revelation, it is singular. It is not plural. It is singular. To say revelations is, well, it's a misnomer. So, don't be accused of being ignorant of what this book is. It is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Singular, not plural. Now, there are multiple indications throughout this book that Christians are being persecuted for their faith. The persecution is growing in intensity and in scope. We read in Revelation 1:9, John is a brother and companion in the suffering that the saints are enduring because of their faith. It also speaks of their afflictions, slander, and suffering. In Revelation chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, the devil will put some of you in prison, John writes. You will suffer persecution. Most scholars take a later date in the 90s for this book, which would place the Christians in the Roman Empire when Domitian was the emperor. He was a very cruel emperor who wanted to deify himself. He hated Christians and he loved to persecute them, and that very likely is the setting and the time frame of this book. Indeed, the believers were tempted to turn away from their newfound faith. There are different reactions to this persecution. For some, it inspired them to more faithfulness. Others denied Christ. Still, even some sought to strike a deal with pagan powers. Others wanted to revert back to Judaism. Still, in spite of suffering, the book of Revelation is filled with comfort for those who are being persecuted, and there is a stern warning for those who are trying to avoid it. Let's consider the genre of Revelation for just a moment. Revelation is a letter. It has an opening, it has a closing. It resembles the letters that we looked at from the New Testament when we studied the epistles as a form of New Testament genre. So it is a letter. We read when John says, John, to the 7 churches in the province of Asia, grace and peace to you, and so forth. You can read that the passage here on the slide. It starts exactly like a letter. It ends like a letter. John concludes his letter with this phrase, the grace of the Lord Jesus be with God's people. Amen. So we have an opening and a closing that resemble a New Testament letter. It was actually a letter that was written to be circulated among the churches of Asia Minor. Let's look at a map of where the 7 churches in the Revelation are located. You can see from this map that the 7 churches are clustered together in somewhat of a circle, and it would be very easy to send the letter. If John, by tradition, we think he was in the area of Ephesus because of the persecution. So he's exiled to the island of Patmos, which you can see there on the map, off the coast there, away from Ephesus a little bit. And he had the vision, and then this letter was, after written, it was taken and circulated to the 7 churches. In fact, a great way to start a study in the book of Revelation, if you've never done one before, is to take the first 3 chapters, introduce it, and you have 7 letters to 7 churches. It makes a great preaching series. You can compare each of the churches. There's a commendation, a condemnation, and other facts about each of the 7 churches. It's a great way to start in your teaching or preaching career to work your way into this great letter. So we see that Revelation is a letter. It has an opening and a closing that resemble the New Testament letter. It was written to be circulated, and it is situational. You remember we talked about this. There is a particular situation for which John wrote this letter, and of course it's persecution. The challenge of this letter is that we should be overcomers. In the middle, we see the struggle to overcome. At the end, we see the inheritance that the overcomers will receive. So there is comfort even in the midst of persecution. That's the message of this great book. Revelation is not only a letter, it's a prophetic letter. There is much prophecy in this letter, and we're going to see that as we get to chapter 4 and following, that there's this prophetic nature of this book. So it is a letter, it is prophecy, and it is, thirdly, apocalyptic. But let's focus on the prophetical nature of this letter. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take it to heart, what is written in it, because the time is near. So it is prophecy as well as letter. Another example, John explicitly states, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this scroll. Revelation 22:10. The time is near. We see in the prophetic nature of this letter that prophecy includes both prediction of the future and proclamation of God's truth for the present. When we study the genre of prophecy in the Old Testament, we see this is exactly the language that the Old Testament prophets used. It was a foretelling in that it is predicting, and yet it is a forthtelling of what God is doing in the present. So if you want to use alliteration of P's, you can use prediction, proclamation, or if you like the F's, it's forthtelling and foretelling. Now we see on this slide the third element of this letter of Revelation. It is prophetic and it is apocalyptic. Apocalyptic writing uses a heavenly messenger to reveal God's promise to intervene into human history. And then God's intervention will overthrow empires, and he will establish his kingdom, and thus justice will be done in the end. One of the characteristics of apocalyptic literature is that it is very symbolic, and that is part of our challenge in interpreting this book. So the images in Revelation create this symbolic world that transforms how the reader and the hearer sees and understands the world around. So one of the purposes of the Revelation is to help answer the question, who is Lord? Is it Jesus or Caesar? In the early gladiatorial exchanges, often the emperor would say, if you would just say, Caesar is Lord, then we'll let you go and you can live. But the Christians could not say that because they knew that Jesus is Lord. Why would the Caesar do this? Why would the emperor do this? Well, because in the Roman Empire, the emperor was considered to be God. Domitian deified himself. He thought he was God, and like Apollos. And so when believers said, you're not God, there's only one God, there's only one Lord, and that's Jesus, that was a threat to him. So he would have them killed, he would have them persecuted. Very simplistically, we can say that the main message of Revelation is God will be victorious in the end. Now, class, one of the most important elements to interpreting Revelation is to understand the different approaches. Now, there are four basic approaches, and if you take the eclectic view of Duval and Hayes, we'll see in a moment, there are five. They present five in this book. The preterist approach are people that interpret the book of Revelation in the historical context, and they attempt to understand the book in the way the original audience would have by seeing the events, or most of the events, as being fulfilled in the first century. So, one of the things you have to do when you begin to build your commentaries in your library is that you need to understand what is the perspective of the commentator that I'm reading. If he sees most of the book as having been fulfilled in the first century, then he is a preterist. A second interpretive method for approaching Revelation and interpreting Revelation is the historicist approach. For the historicist, Revelation is a map or an outline of what has happened throughout church history. Now, it takes history as the map, but it looks at all of Christian history over 2,000 years. The preterist approach sees it as having been fulfilled in the first century primarily. Now, the particular approach that probably most Baptist students are familiar with would be the futurist approach. The futurist views most of the book as relating to the future. Precisely at chapter 4, where the Lord gives John the vision and he calls him up to heaven. So, the futurists see the majority of this book as yet to be fulfilled. Now, do you see the difference? The preterist sees most of the book as having been fulfilled in the first century. The historicist interprets the book of Revelation in light of Christian history, 2,000 years of it. The futurist sees the major portion of the book, starting at chapter 4 and following, as having yet to be fulfilled. It is in the future. Now, the idealist does not understand Revelation with respect to any particular reference to time, but just says it's a struggle between good and evil. Sometimes this is called the spiritual approach. Duval and Hayes suggest an eclectic approach that appropriates the strengths of all the previous approaches and discards the weaknesses of those approaches. In other words, it takes the best of all views and puts that together into an eclectic approach. And this is their particular approach to interpreting the book. Now, what we're going to do is take their eclectic view. We're going to take Revelation through its 5 steps, and this will get you started in your interpretation of the book. However, I want you to supplement your readings in Fee and Stewart because they will take us much further in depth, more in a master's level approach and understanding and study of this book. Certainly, Duval and Hayes have some good advice to read this book with humility, discover the message to the original readers. Don't try to discover a chronological map that's going to chart out future events and plugs in interpretation of everything that happens in the newspaper every week, and it gets plugged into this chronological map. Do take it seriously, but not always literally. What do they mean by that? Well, for example, you have a lot of symbolism in this book, and it is difficult to interpret what a lot of these symbols mean. For example, a dragon that has a tail that sweeps through the stars. This is symbolism, so we have to be very careful students of what these symbols mean, and you're going to see different interpretations as you come to the different commentaries. That's part of the challenge of interpreting this book. And well, let's just jump in and see some application here. As we interpret Revelation, let's learn to pay attention when John identifies an image. Look to the Old Testament and the historical context when you seek to interpret images and symbols. And be careful about pressing details to where you might be tempted to overinterpret some of these symbols. So as a way of review, here are our steps to interpretation. Grasping the text in their town, that is, we must interpret the symbols in the passage. For example, who's the woman? The answer would be the true Israel. How about the dragon? Well, this is going to be Satan or the devil. The male child, of course, is Jesus Christ. So when we complete step 1, when we grasp the text in their town, we're seeing that God has defeated Satan. The victory is certain. God's people on earth will continue to suffer as victims of the devil's rage. All right, the next thing we want to do is step 2, measuring the width of the river to cross. Now, we are not part of Domitian's Roman Empire. Churches in North America really are not persecuted. Oh yeah, we have some brushes with local governments that want to silence the voice of the church and so forth. We see this happen periodically, but we are not really under persecution. Not to where we are in danger of our lives, like our brothers and sisters are in some parts of the world today, where they could come in and it could cost you your life for worshiping Jesus. So we are different in the sense that we are not under the same kind of persecution pressure that we see in Domitian's day or even in other parts of the world today. So our job is to principalize this truth. There is a real devil that is opposed to God. He is bent on deceiving and destroying God's people. Satan has been defeated by the life and redemptive work of Christ. Now, these are truths. These are principles that even though we may not be in a persecution setting in America, these principles are still at work. In fact, the fact that we're not under persecution sometimes can be, some would say, a detriment, that the persecuted church always spreads and thrives. We see this on the mission field all the time. So, Christians can overcome the devil by living and proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ faithfully. Yes, in a persecuted setting or in a non-persecution setting, that is a principle. Christians can expect to suffer for being faithful to their witness to Christ. And indeed, we know that that can happen even in our setting today. We hear about people who have lost their jobs, who suffer persecution in certain communities, and they're ridiculed and so forth. But expect that when you stand for Christ, that you are going to receive some degree, some measure of suffering when you and I are faithful to the witness, our witnesses to Christ. Next, in step 4, we consult the biblical map. That is, the Bible clearly affirms the theological principles that we identified. Make sure that you have your principles backed up by the rest of Scripture. And in step 5, we grasp the text in our town. That is, we are going to apply it to our specific setting. Students, I recommend that you take a few moments and read back through the materials. This specific example has come from Revelation 12, a very symbolic chapter, and I think the authors have done a good job at taking us through on a cursory reading there. But you'll also want to look at their outline, their overall outline for the book. That will help you get a grasp on the sections within the book and ways that you could preach it, and maybe do some summary preaching or teaching on the book. So you've got your 7 churches that give you a good introduction to the letter element. That takes us through chapters 1, 2, and 3. Then we see that beautiful vision of God and the Lamb in 4 and 5. And then the wrath begins to pour out, the seals in 6, 7, and 8. Then you have the trumpets in 8, 9, 10, and 11. And then the people of God versus the powers of evil in 12, 13, 14. And then the pouring out of the bowls, 15 and 16. The judgment of Babylon, 17, 18, 19. And then the ultimate victory at 19, verse 6 and following. Then you have a nice conclusion to wrap up the letter at the end. So, hopefully you're getting a grasp on and seeing that this book is very interpretable, and that you can use this in your ministries and teach it, and not be confused or afraid to step in and preach revelation to your people. I would just recommend one other thing, that when you get ready to start the book of Revelation, you can't just jump into it and expect that with a few hours of study you're going to be ready to do this. I would suggest that you plan this out and give yourself several months to get prepared, to get your commentaries together, to determine which view that you're going to follow, and then you get your particular commentaries and do your study and organize this and decide how long you're going to preach through it. And that way you'll have a firm grasp on how to take this. But each of your messages use the 5-step approach that we've been teaching you.